So now we've reached the ultimate episode of Herbert West Reanimator, Part 6, The Tomb Legions. So this was again released in an episodic format, so half of this episode is a recap of the previous ones, which I think is a real shame. He could have just recapped it briefly without having to spend most of the story writing it, but I suppose he's getting paid for this, so the more he can recap, the less he has to actually write in terms of news story to be able to get paid for releasing an entire episode on here. So now we've finally reached the 16 or 17 years in the future from when they graduate from college, and the Dr. Herbert West has finally disappeared. And the Boston Police are noticeably upset about this. People have been suspicious about West, but now that he's actually gone, they start to suspect the main character, who is his best friend and confidant. So we get this recapping about West had been trying to reanimate corpses. They always needed very fresh corpses. They got to the point where they were killing off people so that the corpse would be super fresh, and that they went into World War I so they could get lots of corpses and bodies and body parts and all that other kind of stuff. And we also get some descriptions of all the different corpses we found over the years, that there have been corpses that involve clawing graves, and corpses that are put into insane asylums, and other kinds of corpses that were not entirely human bodies or parts of bodies, and so on. So again, most of this is just a recapping of all the things that we have heard about in the first 5 stories. And then we say that one of them was in particular a major in the Canadian Army. Then that was the one that was flying overhead in the airplane, and then the airplane got shot down and they decapitated, well, he was mostly decapitated, but they decapitated him the rest of the way and put the head in a jar and the body in a table, and they reanimated the body and the head started speaking. So the two of them were still somehow mysteriously connected. So here they are, West living in this lovely place in Boston, next to an old cemetery, and deep in the basement he finds that there's a tomb, but he decides he's not going to actually open up the wall to the tomb because it's a little too creepy for him, and plus the bodies in there are long dead, so they can't be used by him in his various activities. And while they are sitting there reading the paper one night, they hear that a strange thing happened at the asylum. And again, this is part of Lovecraft that I have an issue with. I like the times when he's writing first person that someone is having something happen to them, but often he likes to go down these threads of, like even in this one, where we're finally to almost the present, but we're saying that he's a year beyond when the body disappeared. So even now we're looking back a year about what happened, and we're having these people read a newspaper incident about something else that happened. So we're hearing all these things third hand, and I don't understand why Lovecraft has to do this, why he has to keep putting layer upon layer between us and what's happening so that we don't get that immediacy sense. So in any case, the main character is reading this story about a newspaper article of the asylum, and in the asylum a group of silent men came in, and one of them was a military figure who talked without moving his lips and who was carrying an immense black case, which, you know, pretty clearly now this is like the Canadian Army major carrying his head in the box. And it turns out that the face is just a wax face with painted eyes, which at the time is how they handled people. If they had greatly disfigured faces, they'd make masks for them so that they could go about society without people all gasping in sadness at the injuries that they had. So in any case, the major has gone with all of his zombie friends. They're trying to get the release of the person who was put into the insane asylum, who was the doctor from the college from back when they were in college. The people at the insane asylum, of course, say, no, you can't just take random inmates out of their cells, in which case the zombies all started attacking them and got the guy released anyway. So they were able to release the zombie that was in the asylum and then take him away. And of course, this makes West and his main character very unhappy, knowing that there's this horde of zombies. But do they do anything about it, like go to safety or get police protection or anything else? No. They just sit there in their house, where the zombies know they are, so that they're nice and easy to find. So at midnight, the doorbell rings. All the servants are asleep in the attic. So the main character goes down and answers the bell. You know, how about you don't answer the bell when zombies are afoot and you know they're coming after you, even if you don't feel like it's safe to go, like, to a police station or somewhere safe. So he opens the door, and strange figures, he lets them into the house, carrying a large square box, which they put in the hallway, and then they all leave. So why would you let them bring a box into the house? Luckily, I mean, they didn't attack him or anything. So anyway, they all leave, and then West comes down, and it's 2 foot square. And it says that it's from the captain, who is the guy that they chopped their head off the rest of the way in World War I. So West is upset and decides that he's going to incinerate it because they have an incinerator in their basement, because of course they do, because of all the experiments that they're running. So they don't open it. That's at least a mark of sanity. You would think in many of these movies they'd open it up and something would come pouring out and attack them. But no, they decide we don't even want to open this thing up. We're just going to stick it into the incinerator and get rid of it, which they do. So they bring it down, they put it into the incinerator, and then all of a sudden the wall, which is where the ancient tomb was in their basement, starts to crumble. And all these zombies come through. Some were human, some were semi-human, some were fractionally human. There's the stalking thing with the beautiful head made of wax, the mad-eyed monstrosity, and they all spring upon West and tear him into little pieces, and then carry the pieces of him off. And then it says that they tore him to pieces, but somehow the eyes were still alive in the head as they carried the head off. They were hideously blazing with their first touch of frantic visible emotion. So somehow, even though this body's been torn to pieces, it's still living. Maybe they put some sort of magical elixir into him, or maybe just their zombie atmosphere was able to keep him alive. So the next morning, the servants find him. The incinerator just has the ashes of the box. West is gone, and that wall is now resealed. You could say, well, how did it get resealed? Well, if these things could carry away a body that's torn into lots of pieces and still have the person seeming to be conscious, surely they can do some sort of magic that gets the wall to reseal itself. But, part of it is saying, well, maybe he's just been driven mad and he finally did put West into the incinerator, and this is just the way that his mind was working. That must be the result of all these zombies. I couldn't possibly have done something this horrible. Or maybe the energy of all the zombies worked through me to put him into the incinerator and burn him up. You would think that someone would have seen people putting a box into their house, or that there'd be some sort of marks from the box, or all sorts of other ways that they could prove that there had been a box. But that's not the purpose of the story. The story is just trying to be scary. But it doesn't really seem, again, that scary to me, because we know where it's going. We know as soon as they start talking about all these different things that they're all going to band together and get some sort of revenge, I suppose. And we know that the main character has to survive, because he's been telling this story the entire way, which is part of why I don't like when Lovecraft does these kinds of layouts. Because we know he's going to live, because he's been telling us the story from the beginning. And we get a sense that West will probably die, because they were heading in that direction, that there's going to be some sort of revenge and that he was going to vanish. So, sort of anticlimactic. Again, have to say, one of the first zombie stories, so he gets credit for that. He gets lots of enormous negative marks for the racism that has been throughout this, more strongly in some episodes than in others. And I'm glad I read it in the sense that I wanted to have a full sense of Lovecraft's writings, but this is not something I will go back to in the future. So let me know your thoughts on this story, what you think about it, and hopefully we'll see what comes next. Hopefully it's something a little more interesting to me.